This is a statue of Robert E. Lee and his horse Traveler in Charlottesville, Virginia. As we probably know, Lee was the top military leader of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and at first glance, it might seem fairly innocuous. The world is full of statues of dead people, but there is a growing movement to remove Confederate statues throughout America, arguing that they represent racism and celebrate the enslavement of African Americans. In fact, this particular statue was slated to be taken down. In February of 2017, the Charlottesville City Council voted to remove it. And in June of that same year, the mayor and city council unanimously decided to change the park's name from Lee Park to Emancipation Park, which is a huge change. But in August of 2017, a Unite the Right rally organized by neo-Nazis and white supremacists took place in Charlottesville. Its stated goal was unifying the American white supremacist movement and opposing the removal of this statue. On the night of August 11th, a tiki torch-lit procession marched through the nearby University of Virginia campus. Then, the day after this march, the rally encountered counter-protesters. Violence ensued, culminating in a self-identified white supremacist ramming his car deliberately into a crowd of pedestrians at 28 miles per hour. One person, Heather Heyer, was killed. 19 others were injured. He was convicted of violent crimes. But how did we get here? How is it possible for a statue to be the catalyst for so much violence and anger? How can a simple statue represent so powerfully such different things to different people? Whenever we get into debates about the removal of Confederate statues, one argument that always seems to come up is that by removing them, we are destroying history. And I want to talk about this today, because I think the questions I've raised are related to the larger question of how we remember the past and what exactly history is. I am Joe McMenamin. I teach history here at Saddle River Day School, and I want to talk a little bit about monuments, memorials, and museums. In many ways, these are the most public ways in which we encounter history, and they tell us a story. But before we get into that, we need to take a step back and consider the question, what is history? We often think of history as simply everything that's happened before the present. World War II, the Big Bang, ancient China, and Neanderthals are all part of what we might term history. But I want to challenge that idea. History isn't simply what's come before now, it's a story we tell ourselves about those events. When we study history, we're not really studying some objective past or a list of factual events. What we're studying is the stories we tell ourselves about the past that we often claim to be objective and true. We can even see this distinction in the etymology of the word. Our word history comes from the ancient Greek historia, which literally means both finding out, as in truth, and narrative, as in fiction. It's true even in some languages today. In Spanish, historia means both story and history. Same is true in German, though it's a different word. So history isn't simply the past, it's how we remember the past. We even have a word in English, prehistory, for events in the past that are not given to us orally or in writing. So World War II in ancient China, that's history. That's passed down to us as a story. The Big Bang and Neanderthals, that's not. Those are known to us through science. When we talk about the quote-unquote history of the Big Bang, we're really talking about the history of that theory, the history of the Big Bang's discovery, which has more to do with Belgium in the 1920s than with the event itself 14 billion years ago. And language is important here, because we may be thinking that, of course, history is an objective event. No one disputes that the 13 colonies fought a war against Great Britain, which resulted in their independence. But part of what gets mixed into these facts is a value judgment about those facts by the language we use. The American Revolution, for example, is known as the War for American Independence in Great Britain today, not the American Revolution. So was it not revolutionary then? This is a minor point, but it does make a difference. The way we tell a story changes what it means, just as the way we depict historical figures matter and the details we emphasize matter. Let's look at a recent example. This is a screenshot from Wikipedia, which is a great indicator of how culture views an historical event. And the page for the recent events in Minneapolis is titled Twin City Riots. Note that in the first line, the article clearly says they are also called the Floyd protests. Is it a riot or a protest? These words mean drastically different things. History is obviously written by the winners, so who will win? In the end, which of these terms will become its title? Now it's time to take a look at what all this means for museums, monuments, and memorials. Architect Walter Gropius once said that architecture is the most public of arts. In this thinking, people are exposed to more art through architecture than any other means. We may talk a lot about paintings and sculpture and theater, but the vast majority of people aren't really exposed to those arts that often. Or we have to pay to go see them. But we can see beautiful buildings constantly as we simply go about our day. I think the same argument can be made about public monuments and memorials with history. The majority of us don't read historical books, but many of us have passed by a statue in a park or a historical marker or been to a memorial. In many ways, this is how the public is exposed to history. But what are they teaching us? What stories are they telling, and do we read them critically? Let's look at museums. Sociologist Tony Bennett has argued that museums were created literally to build modern citizens. In 1848, almost every city of Europe saw a popular revolution spring up in an attempt to topple the government. They wanted to fight repression, censorship, and autocracy. If we flash forward to the 19th century, in some circles, this became known as the Museum Age. All across Europe, governments were inviting all of its citizens into these institutions to look at precious objects from around the globe. Why? What would possess a government to allow these ordinary citizens, the rabble, who just recently have risen up in revolt, to come in close proximity to their treasures? The answer simply was control. By going through a museum, you are told a story about your culture. In America and Europe, this story was often about your empire, and this empire was the end of a long line of great civilizations. Ancient Egypt gave way to ancient Greece, which gave way to Rome, which gave way to industrialized Western empires. It was a progress narrative that shows the poorest citizens to have pride in their nation, not fight against it. It argued that they were superior to the rest of the world despite their low status in their home country. And this engraving shows it perfectly. A well-to-do gentleman shows a shabby working man art in a museum. By doing so, the shabby man becomes more refined. It was a way to instill higher class attitudes in the lower classes, which of course includes decorum and politeness, the very antithesis of revolutionary traits. And all of this gave the government greater control. So stories have remarkable power, and the classic institutions that we tend to think give us an objective view of history actually are designed to tell a specific story. They aren't objectively true, but then neither is history itself. Let's shift to a memorial. This is the Vietnam Memorial, perhaps the most famous in America today. It consists of two identical walls. Each stretches about 250 feet, includes 72 panels of reflective black granite, and on them are etched the names of over 58,000 American service members killed or missing in the Vietnam War. What's it telling us? First, it's somber. It doesn't highlight the victories in the war. The sole criteria for including a name is only that they're missing or deceased. The war is about loss in this reading. Survivors aren't listed. The amount of names also culminatively reveals the event's tragic scale. It might seem common now to have names listed, but this was revolutionary at the time. It's also about these individuals. The names are not listed alphabetically. They're listed by the date they were deceased. Why? The designer, Maya Lin, argued this would make people with a common last name like Smith feel less special if they were alphabetized. So by upsetting our expectation, it forces a deeper engagement with the memorial. We have to search out the names. The reflective wall forces the visitor to see themselves reflected back among the names. You become part of the memorial. All of this is interesting, right? Most interesting, perhaps, is the color. It's not white marble that we often associate with war memorials like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and, as seen here, the World War II Memorial, which are all white. The Vietnam Memorial is black. It reminds us of mourning. These are funeral colors, and it doesn't express triumph. As you walk along it, you begin to slowly be overtaken by its walls. You're taken literally underground at the very center of it, where the wall is about 10 feet high, and you become buried, as behind the wall is solid earth. There are subtle hints of glory. Each of the two walls points to a specific other memorial, one the Lincoln Memorial, the other the Washington Memorial. So these soldiers are pointing to our two greatest presidents. This memorial, however, was heavily criticized at the time. Tom Carhart, a Vietnam veteran and the main antagonist of the wall, wanted a grand white marble memorial which glorified the soldiers. Famously, he called the wall a black gash of shame when he saw the designs. The line was meant as a criticism, but in many ways it's true. But it's also a feature, not a flaw. The wall is something of a scar. And that tells us about the story the wall is telling. Let's take a look at the three soldiers statue. This was erected 2 years after the wall. It represents a compromise between people like Tom Carhart and people like Maya Lin, the two designers. It depicts three young soldiers of varying races and services carrying weapons. What's it telling us about the war, though? The soldiers are alive, looking off in the same direction. They're doing their duty. It's not just about those who died or went missing. It's about everyone. It's about carrying forward. But it's not joyous or triumphant either. Though, again, it's not somber or mournful. In some ways, it passes less judgment on the war. But the collective American imagination doesn't remember this memorial as well as the wall. And that's important. This takes us back to General Lee. There's no one way to view the past. Our history isn't objective and fixed. The General Lee statue was completed in 1924, the height of KKK membership in the United States. The statue doesn't really represent Lee. It represents how Lee was remembered in 1924, which is to say the statue is a testament to the white supremacy movement of that decade in many ways. Of course, this is controversial. After the Civil War, Robert E. Lee told in an interview, quote, "I am rejoiced that slavery is abolished." Conversely, before the war, Abraham Lincoln had said, quote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." Which is the exact opposite of what we imagine each of these people to say. So what do we do with this information? The key, it seems to me, is to embrace the uncertainty of history, remembering that history isn't an objective account of the past, and neither are our monuments or museums which celebrate that. We sometimes think that we are, though, that they are, though, and we sometimes demand that history offer a certainty on what happened. Unfortunately, that's not possible. We have to decide for ourselves how we remember the past. We get to decide what's in our history, what's not in our history, and how we tell the story. And as uncomfortable as it might be, we might want to be more willing to accept the uncertainty of the past.